wave in the ocean to complete its course. Even the biggest tsunami will dissipate ultimately into the sand or the ground, the land. And we have never learned how to do this. We teach children for academics, the intelligence quotient we teach to. We require them to understand socializing, to learn social cues. We try to teach a creative quotient and the arts. What do we miss? And why? We miss the emotional quotient. We miss teaching them emotional literacy in large measure because we haven't learned to raise our emotional intelligence. So another tool, in addition to non-reactivity, is that of emotional tolerance. Another metaphor that I can offer you is to think of yourself as the cup and your child as the tea in the cup. No one can drink the tea unless it's in a container. Be the container for your child's emotions. You can do that without any reaction, without any input, trying to stay neutral, trying not to join the drama, be the antidote to their drama. Excuse me. And as your children get older, if I can offer you yet another really important tool, I'm going to ask you to learn to deeply listen. And deep listening involves emotional tolerance. It means without rescuing, without protecting, just allow your child to learn the lessons of the world, to learn to tolerate his emotions, and for you as the parent to stop having expectations. I'd love to go on to essential and non-essential boundaries, and I have so much more I would love to teach, but I would also, Neva, would you like me to entertain some questions?
Hey, yes, thank you so much. Let's go right into Q&A. Thank you for giving us the basis of that. Really appreciate it. I was just making my notes, getting ready to ask you, some deep questions. Now, if anyone wishes to ask questions, yes, I've seen comments in the chat box. You can do that. If you would like to, your voice to be heard, you can definitely raise your hand and I will unmute, but you'll also have to unmute yourself. So basically, if your hand, I've noticed if there's any hand risen, I'll just click on for you to speak, or you could simply type in. So here's some questions that I made note of. Right during the pandemic, I noticed and I've heard that there are a lot of children being abused. Okay, so at the time, actually, when it broke out, COVID-19, I was actually outside of the country and specifically Jamaica. And what I heard from, different public service announcements, kids are being abused and the rise, so COVID is going up, but the rise in child abuse is going up. What do you think was the cause of that?
It's a great question, Neva. And I really believe that parents have an illusory belief that we have control. All of us, not just parents, non-parents as well, we lived in this illusion, and it was completely false, that our lives were in control. We knew about our jobs. I mean, things happened that we had no control over, but our day-to-day lives, we were in our comfort zones, and we just were happy to live and know this money is coming in, or we can buy food in this grocery store, we can do what we want and go to this concert. And all of a sudden, right, we learned an enormous lesson. And it's so fascinating to me that this virus has taught so many lessons. And one of the greatest lessons of the virus is that we truly do not have control. And I think that many people and parents were unable to cope with the idea that this microorganism that no one can see with the naked eye took over the life of just about every human on the planet. Correct? And all of a sudden jobs were lost. And when jobs were lost and money's not coming in, and then people have fears about groceries. And when we as adults and parents get agitated and anxious, what do? We dump it. We dump it on the children. The children were not responsible for this pandemic either, but I truly believe that the loss of the sense of control, which was never real in the first place, but we lived with a belief that we had control, caused people to get very anxious. And they got anxious when money got tighter and jobs got lost and people got furloughed, and in some areas food was unavailable, and then our sources of socializing shut down. It caused a lot of anger, anxiety, and worry. And what do parents do? They don't know how to tolerate all these feelings within themselves. And those who don't have the skills to control and cope with their own emotions dump it onto their children. So what I just want to finish by saying is that there's only one thing we have control of in this world. It's the thing all of us forget, is that we have control of our own minds. We have control of our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, and our reactions. We do not have control of anything external. From a grade on a test to a microorganism that causes a pandemic, we don't have control. Let's start controlling our thoughts and our feelings and our internal process. And hopefully that horrible problem of dumping it on children, which leads to abuse, will stop.
Okay, so let me just rephrase. So you're saying if we can control our thoughts and our emotions, this will help in not taking out our frustration on our child or children. That's what you're saying, yeah?
Exactly. Thank you for saying it so well. I'm saying that we have an illusion, a false illusion of control. And when that gets shattered, we can't cope. So it's the parent's job to learn to cope with their own feelings rather than dumping it onto their children in these terrible ways.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And I'm going to read one of the comments. This is going back to the beginning. Criticism and reaction can be wounding to our children. Profound question. In that moment of anger, frustration, how can we as parents remain neutral when we are so triggered? How can we give the impression of neutrality, just being neutral?
That is the fundamentally important question to being a parent. How do we do it? We train ourselves. So this work that I do is sort of like going to a gym. You can't go to the gym once and decide, now I'm strong and I'm finished with the gym, right? Exercise is a lifelong process, as is the learning process in being a conscious parent. But it starts with a single step. And it always begins with noticing, with observing. So the first thing you do when you're triggered, and our children trigger us, it is their job to trigger us. It is what they do because they are our mirrors, because we see in them our own patterns that we don't like. So we get triggered. Now, what triggers you, Neva, will not trigger me, which is why we have to understand that these triggers are due to our own internal landscape. So what do? Is you start with a pause. The simplest and most profound thing you can do as a parent is before you say a word, you pause and you take a breath or a few deep breaths. And if you can't control it, you excuse yourself. No matter how sassy and rude and disrespectful that child is being, you excuse yourself and take a pause and tell the child, I will be with you in a few minutes and we will talk about this, and get yourself to a neutral place. And if I can just share, because I think it's such an important lesson, please remember that when your child exhibits behaviors that are untoward, I don't even want to say bad because I don't believe in bad and good, but behaviors that are untoward, behaviors that upset us, when your child is upset, whether he's being rude or very depressed, please remember that he's speaking the only language he knows to try to tell you, the parent, that he has an unmet emotional need. Look beneath the behavior for the problem. And that is the parent's job. And if you're going to react and trigger, you're going to get stuck in the conflict and the dynamic. I call it a tug of war, where you're both going to be pulling on the rope and no one gets anywhere. The parent lets go of the rope. The child is allowed to fall back gently, feel his emotions, and then together, in a neutral way, the parent can be the support for the child. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. There's someone that raised their hand, Maria. Now, Maria, I'm going to allow you to speak. if you, of course, you don't have to worry, guys, if you want to speak, you're not going to be on video. It's just going to hear your voice, all right? So I'm going to unmute. So Maria, if you want to unmute yourself, you can feel free. You have to unmute yourself. If not, I'm just going to ask you to type. Your hands is up.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to ask another question. Oh, I could see. All right, you need to unmute, my dear.
No hurry.
All right, so in the time being, you mentioned you stopped reading report cards. So how do you track your child's process or progress?
Good
Yes.
question. Good question. It's not that the point of not reading report cards was not to get attached to the numbers and the letters. It doesn't mean you give up your parental role of knowing what's going on in your child's life. So you can, assess grades and look and see, what's happening with your child. For example, if the child's grades are all very high and then they start to fall, well, the parent has to figure out what's going on beneath. Have the grades fallen in what subject? And if it's in one subject, does the child need help in that subject? My point is not that there's an absolute right and wrong and don't ever read a report card, although I really did not. The point is to attune to your child and discern what is going on with your child. Because if let's say a pattern of grades falls in a subject, it could be that there's a social problem going on in their lives at school that they don't know how to articulate or haven't felt safe to tell you about. Maybe they're being excluded. Maybe someone's hurting them. The point is that we don't disconnect from our children. We disconnect from the external measures that are being imposed upon them, and we deeply connect with them. And that does mean having some understanding of how they are doing in school and also really tuning into their emotions. I hope that helps you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So guys, just want to remind you, if you have any question, you could drop it in the Q&A or the chat box. I tried to bring Maria in, but I'm not sure what's happening on her end, maybe some technical difficulties. Now, I spoke with a parent the other day, and she has a teenager in college. And she feels as if the child is ungrateful. That she's worked so hard, she made sure that, whatever she wants, her wants are being met. However, on the other end, the child feels the mother is selfish and she gives attention to others versus herself.
Right. So it sounds like, I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, it sounds like whenever there's a lack of gratitude in a child, something is troubling the child, or that gratitude hasn't been modeled. Now, it's hard to answer a particular situation, and I do want to share that anyone who'd like a free consultation who's listening is welcome to go to enlightenedparenting.co. It is not .com, it's .co for coach. And look me up. Enlightened Parenting is the name of my business, and I'd be happy to give anyone a 30-minute consultation to discuss a particular situation like that. But I can already tell you that the child has some unmet needs because conditions have been set in the home that child doesn't feel that his needs are being honored the way that child needs it, and he may be showing that by a lack of gratitude. I have dealt with parents who call me hysterically saying their children are selfish. And as I always say, there's no such thing as a selfish child. There are selfish behaviors. Okay, the child that you're talking about, this teenager, is not necessarily ungrateful, but certainly showing ungrateful behaviors. And what I suggest to that parent is that she look beneath that behavior and try to ascertain and discern what is troubling that child, because usually it's a pattern in the parent. You see, it's always about the parent, and it's hard for us to own that. But those parents willing to own that I am the one responsible for setting up the conditions in this home and being the role model. So a child like that is really using a lack of gratitude to scream at his parents. Now, I just want to share, Neva, that I tell parents, especially teenagers, they scream in strange ways. They can scream in silent ways. They can scream through lack of gratitude, through selfishness. I know one young woman was screaming by being a hoarder and having mold growing in her room. It was such a mess. That was her way of screaming, "You're not meeting my needs." And it's always important to, and if you need help with a coach, to sort of try to figure out how you set the conditions and try to dismantle patterns in the home. That's the path from enslavement to freedom, both for parent and child.
I like the way you said that. Definitely. So, guys, again, Q&A section or chat box. There's a question that was sent in to me, and I'm going to read it. The person basically asked, how do you deal with the terrible twos? A new parent, you're trying not to hit the child because that's how they were raised. So how do you deal with, such a young age and discipline? You want them to know when they're wrong and their consequences. How do you do it without not,
Right, I know what you're saying. The first thing I urge every parent is please, please never, ever, under any circumstance, raise a hand to your child. Ever. There is no circumstance where it is appropriate to hit a child. None. Whoops. Somehow I lost my video. I hope you can see me.
Yes.
Never a moment to hit a child. And I ask you to think, if you were assaulted by another human being, it would be a crime, correct? Right? If someone came up to me because I made them angry and punched me in the face, that's an assault. And there would be consequences in the law. And unfortunately, our children are powerless to go to a district attorney or a police officer, but there is never any situation for even the lightest, or God forbid, the heaviest kind of physical punishment. No washing of the mouths, never. Now, a very young child, the first year of life is all about connection and meeting needs. And the child is crying, they're crying, and you let them cry. And of course, you try to meet needs. And as they get older, naturally, the twos are rough. And parents have to understand that their expectations of what a 2-year-old would be like may not be met by their child who is out of control or screaming a lot. So you can set conditions in the home. I can teach about essential boundaries and soft boundaries. We really didn't have a chance to talk much about consequences. Obviously, for a 2-year-old, one essential boundary that must be adhered to is safety. So you're not going to let your child cross the street alone or put their finger in an electric socket, and you're going to say a gentle no, and you may have to repeat it, but it always should be done, at least as often as it can, neutrally, with neutrality. No, I know you want to stick your finger in that socket, but no. Oh, you're crying. I see you're sad because I didn't let you stick your finger in the socket. And then you distract the child, right? A 2-year-old is pretty easily distracted. So there are all kinds of tools to use with young children, but the one thing the parent must always do is look within and notice your triggers and take deep breaths. And please, especially parents of the youngest children, need to do a lot of self-care so they fill their own bucket and then have energy for their children.
Well, thank you so much.